In 1951, a law passed by the West German government allowed for the mass return of former Nazi officials to public office, including thousands of teachers. For decades, school textbooks ignored an entire swathe of recent history. Educational programs prioritized other periods, and when the war did appear, it was from a single perspective. In classrooms, the recent past wasn't discussed, nor was it discussed in homes. The unwritten instruction was clear: don't ask. While the country was rebuilding, a selective version of its memory was also being constructed. Why did this omission persist for almost 3 decades? Who decided what could be taught and what should be forgotten? And how did this silence impact the generation that grew up without knowledge? The children of silence, the generation that grew up without truth. The first great dilemma of the post-war period arose from the smoking ruins of Berlin. How to teach children what even adults didn't want to remember. While the Nuremberg trials accurately documented the horror of Nazism in German schools, the watchword was silence. The reconstruction of the country wasn't just material, there was also an attempt to reconstruct its history. But that history wasn't confronted head-on, rather it was carefully sidestepped. After 1945, the education system had to train new generations without touching on the darkest years of its recent history. It was a period too recent, too painful. Many teachers had been members of the Nazi Party, and although they knew what had happened, they had neither the tools nor the interest to talk about it. Years later, a report from the Ministry of Justice would reveal that in 1957, more than 75% of the senior officials in the judicial system were still the same ones who had served under Hitler. Something similar happened in schools. Thousands of teachers who had taught during the Nazi regime returned to teaching without any kind of review or filter. School books published between 1949 and 1970 show a clear pattern: avoiding the past. History either stopped in 1918 or jumped directly to the so-called economic miracle of the 1950s. When the war was mentioned, the focus was always the same: the suffering of the German people, Allied bombing, famine, the division of the country. Thus, a history was constructed in which Germany was a victim, not a culprit. This was no accident. Textbooks published by publishers like Schrödel or Volk und Wissen in the 1950s and 1960s featured entire chapters devoted to the First World War, but they ignored the Nazi years. Hitler barely appeared, and when he did, it was as just another authoritarian leader with no further context. Words like Holocaust or concentration camps were completely absent. The omission was part of a political strategy. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer prioritized the reconstruction of the country over any settling of scores. In 1951, an amnesty law was passed that allowed for the massive return of former Nazi officials to the state apparatus. This also included the education system. Thanks to this law, more than 150,000 people linked to the regime were able to return to their positions. In the education sector alone, more than 10,000 teachers and principals were reinstated. Meanwhile, at home, the same thing was happening. Parents and grandparents avoided talking about the past. Thus, a kind of silent agreement was created between school and family. Don't ask. The result was a generation that grew up without really knowing what had happened. They knew there was a war, but not why. They knew about the cities Germany lost, but not the camps where millions died. They learned about the Marshall Plan, but not about the laws that marked millions because of their origins. And this omission wasn't just academic, it was also cultural. German public television began broadcasting in 1952 and, in its early years, systematically avoided discussing Nazism. The same thing happened with cinema. The most watched war films of the 1950s portrayed German soldiers as heroes caught in an absurd war, but they never addressed the real causes of the conflict or the crimes committed. Films like August 15th or The Doctor of Stalingrad reinforced the image of the good German, a victim of other people's decisions. The newscasts also didn't talk about antisemitism or deportations. They focused on reconstruction, international treaties, and progress. And this reinforced the idea that the past shouldn't be touched. The entire cultural apparatus, school, television, film, seemed to work in unison to construct an image of Germany as a damaged country, not a guilty one. In states like Bavaria and North Rhine-Westphalia, school curricula were carefully designed to avoid controversy. An official curriculum approved in 1962 in Bavaria did not include any mandatory mention of Nazism. Only if the teacher deemed it relevant and there was time at the end of the school year could they address it. For almost 30 years, German classrooms were spaces where everything was discussed except the recent past. And that silence wasn't due to ignorance, it was a choice. The phrase, "don't ask," wasn't written on any wall, but everyone knew it was there. The change didn't begin in schools, but in universities. In the late 1960s, a new generation of young people, children of those who had lived through the war, began to demand explanations. They wanted to know what their country had done, what their parents had done. The student movement of 1968 marked a turning point. The protests didn't just occur in universities, they spread to the media, to ministries, and little by little to the classrooms. Beginning in 1969, several states began reviewing their school curricula. Hesse was one of the first to issue an order to include the study of Nazism in history courses. It wasn't yet mandatory, but it was the beginning of a new era. Commissions were formed to review textbooks and change the way they taught. Publishers began receiving different requests. It was no longer enough to teach the facts. Now they had to explain what really happened between 1933 and 1945. Social pressure to confront the past forced the education system to change. Towards the end of the 1970s, some states began to include previously absent topics in their school curricula: fascism, antisemitism, concentration camps. Publishers responded and began publishing textbooks that directly addressed these issues. It wasn't a quick or even change. Many schools continued teaching as before. Many principals resisted. Many old textbooks were still in circulation. But something fundamental had changed. The silence had been broken. By 1980, the wall of silence hadn't completely collapsed, but it was already showing visible cracks. Schools were beginning to cease being havens of oblivion and were becoming, very slowly, spaces where the past could begin to be named. Awakening from trauma when Germany confronted its past. The 1980s marked a decisive shift in the way Germany approached its recent history. What for years had been a systematic omission gradually became a policy of confrontation with the past. This shift was not improvised, it responded to an increasingly evident need. A democracy could not be sustained by silence. The change was complex. In Germany, education is in the hands of each federal state, meaning there is no single curriculum. To coordinate efforts, an entity capable of aligning content without directly imposing it was needed. This task was taken on by the Standing Conference of Ministers of Education, KMK, which in 1981 approved an unprecedented decision. The study of the Holocaust would be mandatory in all secondary schools in the country. The resolution did not limit itself to incorporating dates or events. It required teaching the logic of the Nazi system, its antisemitism, the regime's legal machinery, and the responsibility of civil society. From there, each state was to adapt its curriculum to include these topics in a clear and structured manner. Between 1982 and 1985, most federal states drafted new curricula. Baden-Württemberg, for example, incorporated an entire section devoted to the rise of National Socialism, modern anti-Semitism, and the progressive exclusion of Jews. In North Rhine-Westphalia, secondary schools received new guidelines with specific units on concentration camps, the Nuremberg trials, and denazification. This new approach required a complete overhaul of teaching materials. Old textbooks, which barely mentioned the persecution of Jews, were replaced by books that included entire chapters on the Holocaust. Publishers responded to the new demand by adding photographs of camps, maps of deportations, and original documents. Between 1983 and 1989, publishers such as Cornelsen, Klett, and Westermann launched educational series that included official orders from the regime, excerpts from the Nuremberg laws, and legal texts from the Third Reich, adapted for classroom analysis. The goal was no longer to memorize facts, but to understand how an entire society could allow, and in many cases carry out, genocide. It was about showing that the Holocaust was not the work of a few fanatics, but the result of a complete, legal, and organized system. Teaching this structure became a form of prevention. If one understood how it happened, one could prevent it from happening again. A key advance was the institutionalization of school visits to former concentration camps. In the mid-1980s, several states began organizing field trips as part of the official curriculum. In 1990, the federal government approved a permanent funding program for these activities, ensuring that all students could visit at least one of these sites during their secondary education. These visits were neither optional nor symbolic. They were structured with advanced materials, specialized guides, and subsequent classroom discussion sessions. By 1995, more than 300,000 students a year were participating in these visits, organized by regional education ministries. Sites such as Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Sachsenhausen became supervised educational centers with programs designed by historians and teaching teams. This new educational model was based on a clear idea. Barbarism was not an accident. It occurred within a legal framework with written laws, signed decrees, and official bodies. Showing students these documents, the texts, the seals, the orders, allowed them to understand that this was not a temporary madness, but rather human decisions within perfectly recognizable structures. To reinforce this approach, the educational system advocated for the simultaneous teaching of several subjects. The Holocaust was not only taught in history, it also appeared in literature classes where works censored by the Nazis were read. In ethics and religion, the consequences of social exclusion and propaganda were studied. In biology, the racial theories that served as the basis for persecution were dismantled. This interdisciplinary model was officially adopted by states such as Berlin and Schleswig-Holstein, which required schools to coordinate content across departments. In 1993, the KMK reinforced this strategy with a new resolution calling for linking the study of the Holocaust with democratic education. Key concepts such as individual responsibility, civic courage, and a critical analysis of power were introduced. Curricula included units on how ordinary citizens participated in or failed to resist the system, emphasizing that history is not made by leaders alone, but also by the everyday decisions of millions. German reunification in 1990 posed a new challenge. East Germany had its own approach to Nazism. There, the narrative was that fascism was an expression of Western capitalism and that the GDR, Communist Germany, had been a victim, not an accomplice. This narrative partially exonerated ordinary citizens, presenting them as resistors, not participants. Unifying the education systems on both sides involved delicate work. It wasn't just a matter of changing textbooks. Teachers in the East had to be trained, content adapted, materials revised, and criteria coordinated. Between 1991 and 1998, the Federal Ministry of Education funded dozens of curriculum harmonization programs. Common textbooks were produced, refresher courses were offered for teachers in the East, and federal guidelines were established to ensure a uniform approach. One of the most important objectives of this period was to eliminate the idea that Nazism was an external or imposed phenomenon. It was clearly demonstrated that its rise enjoyed popular support, that its laws were approved by parliaments, and that its ideology was shared by broad sectors of society. During the 1990s, the federal and state governments invested millions of marks in school programs, materials production, teacher training, and subsidies for educational visits. The education budget specifically allocated to historical memory increased from less than 2 million marks in 1985 to more than 45 million in 1998, according to figures from the Federal Ministry for Education. School ceased to be a place of escape and became a place where history was confronted directly. Students learned not only what had happened, but also how it happened, who allowed it, and what signs were ignored. It was a way of preparing citizens of the present to recognize the risks of authoritarianism, discrimination, and silence. The change wasn't just in the content. The objective of history education also changed. It was no longer just about remembering, but about understanding, about connecting past and present, about using history as a tool to assess current events. By the end of the 20th century, Germany had completely transformed the way its schools addressed the past. What began as a top-down imposition, a state measure, became a permanent structure within the educational system. Teaching about Nazism and the Holocaust was no longer a marginal or uncomfortable topic. It was an essential part of democratic education. Classrooms of horror, educating with the scars of the Reich. At the beginning of the 21st century, Germany consolidated a unique educational model, educating new generations by confronting them in a structured way with the darkest episode in its history. The goal was not only to teach what happened, but to do so with the necessary force so that no one would forget it. Thus was born what some experts called the pedagogy of shuddering, a way of teaching that did not avoid the harshest details of the past, but rather presented them with clarity, context, and method. In the 1990s, significant progress had already been made in including Nazism and the Holocaust in school curricula. But starting in 2001, a further step was taken. That year, the Standing Conference of Education Ministers, KMK, approved a new national regulation. All German states would be required to guarantee the teaching of National Socialism in secondary education. It wasn't a recommendation, it was a requirement. The content was distributed in a specific manner. The core section was taught between 9th and 10th grades, students between 14 and 16 years old. A minimum of 20 mandatory teaching hours was established to study the Second World War, the Holocaust, the regime's racism, and its consequences. This course load was to include primary materials, document analysis, legal review, and the use of visual aids under teacher supervision. To ensure its implementation, each state drafted its own detailed curricula. For example, in Bavaria, the curriculum stipulates the use of legal texts from the Nazi regime, such as the Nuremberg laws, as well as the study of official decrees and propaganda from the period. In Berlin, students are required to understand the stages of the exclusion and extermination process from the identification of Jews to the final solution. One of the pillars of this new approach was the systematic incorporation of materials that do not shy away from the harshness of the content. Authentic Third Reich documents, official statements, legal regulations, verified historical images, and texts adapted from propaganda media are used. Many states even allow targeted analysis of excerpts from Mein Kampf in advanced courses, not to disseminate its ideas, but to dismantle its mechanisms of ideological manipulation. In literature, the Diary of Anne Frank has become required reading in many schools. Its study is not limited to the narrative content. The context, the decrees that affected her family, the conditions of her hiding place, and the legal system that allowed her persecution are analyzed. Students also work with other key texts, such as statements by Nazi leaders or military training manuals that reflect the regime's values. In history, the central focus is on understanding how racism became institutionalized. Students study discriminatory laws, such as those of 1935, but also deportation orders, ethnic censuses, and administrative circulars that show the involvement of the entire state apparatus. Classes also examine transportation routes to concentration camps, execution reports, and post-war trials. Between 2002 and 2015, the federal government and states invested in the production of digital school materials to reinforce this learning. The Foundation for Remembrance, Responsibility and Future, EVZ, and the Topography of Terror Center in Berlin developed platforms with databases, interactive timelines, deportation maps, and digitalized archives that students can access directly in class. Digitalization has enabled new ways of teaching. Since 2015, many schools have begun experimenting with tools such as virtual tours of concentration camps, 3D reconstructions, and multimedia resources that allow students to explore official documents with contextual explanations. Institutions such as the Buchenwald Memorial and the Ravensbrück Memorial offer digital tours of the barracks, record rooms, and archives, all integrated with targeted questions and activities for each educational level. Educational video games based on real history have also been developed. One of the best known, Through the Darkest of Times, places the player in the role of a German civilian resisting the Nazi regime since 1933. The game has been approved as a teaching tool in several regions, as it combines moral choices with concrete historical facts without gamifying suffering or trivializing repression. In 2016, the Federal Ministry of Education, together with the EVZ Foundation, launched the Digital Remembrance Culture Initiative to bring this content to students through the formats they consume daily. Projects such as Stolperwege emerged under this framework, an app that guides users through the streets of their city by pointing out the homes of Nazi victims. The app displays names, dates, documents, and photographs, and is used as a basis for school activities in multiple regions. Another notable project was at Ich bin Official, an Instagram account developed by SWR and the Weiss Rose Foundation. The account recreates Sophie Scholl's final months of life as if she herself were documenting the events on social media. Although it's not an official curriculum project, many schools have incorporated it as a teaching resource when addressing the topic of internal resistance against Nazism. Technological integration, however, did not eliminate physical visits. Quite the opposite. School visits to historical sites remain mandatory in most states. High school students must visit at least one concentration camp or Holocaust museum during their school years. These visits, organized weeks in advance, include prior classroom preparation and a subsequent analysis phase. In 2019, more than 330,000 students participated in publicly organized and funded visits. Teachers play a fundamental role in guiding this process. Beginning in 2000, the German government expanded its teacher training programs to include mandatory modules on Holocaust pedagogy. These courses teach not only what content to cover, but also how to do it, how to prepare students before viewing difficult images, how to lead a discussion after a visit to a memorial, and how to integrate what has been learned with the civic objectives of the educational program. Each year, hundreds of teachers attend regional seminars organized by organizations such as the Federal Center for Civic Education, Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, where they receive updated materials, classroom strategies, and guidelines for assessing student understanding of these topics. This educational model has had an impact. According to surveys by the Allensbach Institute, more than 80% of German youth between the ages of 15 and 18 can correctly associate the name Auschwitz with a death camp. More than 70% recognize the Holocaust as a central crime of the 20th century, and a significant majority report having learned about it in school from official materials. Despite these achievements, the education system has had to constantly adapt to avoid oversaturation. In recent years, there has been a debate about how to maintain the impact of learning without it becoming routine. A growing concern is that frequent exposure to images of violence or death can ultimately desensitize students. Therefore, several states have adjusted their teaching guidelines to regulate certain content and reinforce contextual analysis before and after its presentation. In Baden-Württemberg, for example, new school curricula include guidelines for teachers on when and in which classes it is appropriate to show photographs or videos of victims. In North Rhine-Westphalia, it is recommended that all sensitive visual material be accompanied by a clear explanation of its educational purpose. Furthermore, efforts have been made to strengthen the connection between the past and current challenges. Schools address topics such as contemporary xenophobia, antisemitism on social media, and digital denialism, all from a historical foundation of the 20th century. The goal is to connect knowledge with students' reality, showing them that history is not over and that its consequences are still being felt. Since the early years of the new millennium, the German classroom has transformed into a space where the past is not hidden, but analyzed, where history is not a closed book, but a tool for understanding the present. What was once called the pedagogy of shock is no longer limited to emotional impact, but is part of an educational model based on data, context, analysis, and accountability. More than remembering the horror, the goal is to understand how it happened, and from there to educate citizens capable of identifying its signs, resisting its logic, and preventing its recurrence. Eternal guilt, growing up German among moral ruins. German national identity in the 21st century is built on an inescapable fact: historical responsibility for the crimes of Nazism. Unlike other countries, Germany has not based its narrative on heroic deeds or founding myths, but rather on the explicit recognition of its mistakes. And nowhere is this decision more evident than in the educational system. Since the 2000s, the country has strengthened its legal framework to ensure that remembrance is not merely an academic exercise, but an active component of democratic life. The key element in this process is Article 130 of the German Penal Code, which punishes those who publicly approve, deny, or minimize the Holocaust when doing so affects public peace, with up to 5 years in prison. This law, in force since 1960 and expanded several times since then, was amended in 2005 to explicitly include hate speech in digital media and updated again in 2022 to cover content shared on social media or public online forums. German law also prohibits any symbolic display associated with the Nazi regime. This includes the use of swastikas, Hitler salutes, Third Reich uniforms, or slogans linked to radical nationalism. These restrictions apply in public spaces, on television, in performances, and also on school materials. The only permitted exception is when the use is for educational, artistic, or research purposes. This regulation also extends to video games. Until 2018, no video game distributed in Germany could contain Nazi symbols, even in historical contexts. Following a legal revision that year, their inclusion was permitted only if developers could demonstrate that the content had a clearly defined educational, historical, or critical function. The Federal Office for Media Classification, USK, assesses each case individually. This regulatory framework seeks more than just to prevent provocations. It protects memory as a collective value. In practice, it means that any attempt to deny, relativize, or trivialize the crimes of Nazism is considered a direct attack on democratic principles. In schools, this policy has clear consequences. Unlike in countries where history is taught with apparent neutrality, in Germany, teaching about the recent past is structured to clarify what happened, how it happened, and why it should not be repeated. Patriotism becomes a delicate subject. While in other European countries national symbols are celebrated naturally, in Germany every expression of national pride is marked by history. There are no school rituals such as the Pledge of Allegiance, nor are there official patriotic acts. The national anthem is rarely sung in educational institutions, except at sporting events or formal ceremonies, and the use of the flag in unofficial spaces often generates discomfort or suspicion of radical political affiliation. Studies conducted by the Allensbach Institute and the Federal Center for Civic Education, BPB, between 2015 and 2022 show that less than 30% of young Germans say they feel proud to be German. Only 22% believe the country should celebrate its history more. These percentages, far from being seen as a problem, are interpreted by educational authorities as a reflection of the success of a model based on critical thinking, not glorification. German schools not only teach facts, but also implement structured projects to transform knowledge into responsibility. One of the most established programs is the stumbling blocks, or Stolperstein, small bronze paving stones placed in front of homes where victims of Nazism lived. Each stone is engraved with a name, a date, and the place of deportation or murder. Since their inception, more than 90,000 stones have been placed in Germany and other European countries. In the school setting, these projects are seamlessly integrated into the curriculum. Students research municipal archives, consult historical records, and write biographical texts. The process is regulated by local authorities and requires the approval of municipal and educational authorities. The project benefits from public funding and the direct participation of secondary schools, which document their research and collaborate in placement events. Another common activity in many regions is the simulation of legislative processes. In some schools, students participate in exercises that recreate the debate that led to the passage of the racial laws of 1935. Each group represents a political actor from the era, and at the end they analyze how a seemingly stable legal system could have been used to progressively establish exclusion and violence. Beyond the Holocaust, the German education system includes modules on the evolution of antisemitism, international human rights law, and the role of organizations such as the UN and the Hague International Human Rights Tribunal. These contents connect the past with the legal frameworks of the present, showing that recent history is not an anomaly, but a structural warning. The Federal Ministry of Education regularly publishes guidelines for the federal states, recommending that they strengthen the link between national history and constitutional values. The teaching of the German basic law, Grundgesetz, is promoted as part of the history and ethics curriculum, with an emphasis on the articles related to human dignity, equality before the law, and freedom of expression. However, the model has also sparked debate. Some criticize the fact that this guilt-based education can lead to rejection or disinterest in younger generations. In response, authorities have sought to broaden the approach, also including stories of resistance, aid, and solidarity within the same historical period. Since 2015, several states have incorporated optional modules that allow for the study of documented cases of citizens who protected those persecuted, participated in aid networks, or refused to collaborate with the regime. These units do not replace the core of the program, but rather complement it. The idea is to show that even in extreme contexts, individual decisions made a difference. In line with this adjustment, programs have been developed to better integrate students without family ties to German history. In many cities, the student body is increasingly diverse. Children of immigrants from Turkey, Syria, Afghanistan, or African countries with no direct connection to the Nazi past. To ensure that these students do not view memory as something foreign, comparative projects have been created that link the Holocaust with other human rights violations documented by the United Nations. In 2019, the state of Hamburg approved a pilot program in which students analyzed various 20th-century authoritarian regimes, including the Pinochet dictatorship, South African apartheid, and the Rwandan genocide, as part of their civic education. The goal is not to dilute the uniqueness of the Holocaust, but rather to place it within a framework for studying systems of repression and accountability. Despite these efforts, some political parties have attempted to challenge the approach. The far right, in particular, has promoted rhetoric accusing the education system of instilling a negative view of the country. However, laws and public policies have strengthened the protection of mandatory historical content. Any attempt to alter it runs counter to the legislative and judicial consensus that protects Holocaust education as a cornerstone of democracy. This tactic has also included stricter monitoring of legal compliance within the classroom. Since 2018, each land must report documented incidents of denialism, vandalism of memorials, or acts of Nazi symbolism within the school environment. These statistics are used by the Federal Ministry to adjust educational campaigns and distribute additional resources to areas with higher incidences. In parallel, school legal advisory units have been created to ensure that principals and teachers know how to respond to violations of Article 130 of the Criminal Code. Today, being German means knowing that history, not to carry it with you, but to understand what's at stake. Schools don't teach shame, but rather to remember accurately, analyze responsibly, and participate knowledgeably. Instead of building national pride on the past, they build pride on the ability to learn from it. The battle to remember how to teach when no one wants to listen. Over the last decade, the German education system has faced an unexpected challenge, maintaining the teaching of Nazism and the Holocaust as a structural part of citizenship education in a context where direct links and generational urgency no longer exist. This is not an outright rejection or institutional collapse, but rather a slow but sustained transformation of the conditions under which historical memory must be transmitted. Starting in 2010, several internal reports from the Federal Ministry of Education and the federal state administrations warned of the need to review not the content, which remains mandatory, but the implementation frameworks. In the new digital, multicultural, and delocalized context, the structures established between 1980 and 2000 began to reveal their administrative limits. It was no longer enough to establish what should be taught. It was necessary to ensure how it was implemented and how it was followed up. One of the first structural adjustments was the creation of a non-centralized national assessment system that would allow state governments to measure the effective implementation of historical content in schools. Unlike previous years when each state designed its own instruments, minimum criteria were established for verifying curriculum compliance. Since 2013, each state must submit an annual report to the federal government detailing how many hours have been devoted to teaching the period 1933 to 1945, what materials have been used, and which external institutions have been involved. This assessment system was strengthened in 2017 by the introduction of standardized qualitative indicators designed in cooperation with the National Institute for Educational Assessment, IQB. These include the number of schools that integrate historical content into extracurricular activities, the proportion of ongoing teacher training in recent history, and the frequency with which textbooks used at each level are updated. It's not just about verifying that teaching is taking place, but also ensuring that it is done according to defined standards. Another important change has been the emergence of educational audit mechanisms specialized in sensitive historical content. Starting in 2018, several Länder began implementing thematic inspections that review how the Holocaust is taught, how visits to memorials are planned, and how activities linked to National Socialism are documented. These audits, carried out by mixed teams of educators and administrative officials, make it possible to identify shortcomings, areas for improvement, or deviations from the regulatory framework. The instruments of interstate coordination have also changed. In 2020, the Standing Conference of Ministers of Education, KMK, signed a new cooperation agreement to update history framework plans at all levels of secondary education, with a staggered schedule establishing mandatory curriculum reviews every 6 years. This requires the Länder to re-evaluate content, objectives, bibliographies, and methodological formats, ensuring that teaching does not remain stuck in outdated models. At the same time, there has been a significant shift in the types of institutions involved in content production and validation. While in previous decades, documentation centers and memorials were the main external collaborators, today they have been joined by technical universities, media literacy agencies, and constitutional law departments. This expansion responds to an operating principle: to teach the Holocaust not only as a historical fact, but as part of an institutional reflection on law, power, and democratic norms. At the administrative level, another key element has been the formalization of the federal government's direct oversight role in national educational memory projects. Through the EVZ Foundation, Memory, Responsibility and Future, the federal government directly funds programs with specific contractual conditions, pedagogical compliance, impact, traceability, and implementation audits. Between 2015 and 2022, more than 450 school initiatives received funding under this scheme, which has required strengthening accountability and strategic planning at the school level. Since 2021, the model of international cooperation applied to educational remembrance has also been strengthened, with Germany acting as a standard-setting authority. Through its representation at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, it has promoted the adoption of common frameworks for the design of school materials, with an emphasis on historical accuracy and pedagogical appropriateness. In 2022, Germany led the working group for the creation of the Guide for Teaching About the Holocaust in a European Context, adopted by 18 member countries as a baseline reference. In the digital realm, centralized platforms have evolved. While individual and local tools dominated in the previous decade, national platforms with legal support have been launched since 2019. The Lemo Schule de Portal, managed by the Ministry of Culture and Media, offers all schools in the country a free repository of validated content on contemporary history, with modules designed by educational level and supervised by the Leibniz Institute for German History. This model is accompanied by educational usage traceability systems through which schools report how many times each module is accessed, how many students complete it, and what final evaluation they receive. This traceability allows the state to monitor in real time how memory circulates in the school environment. One area that has gained increasing attention is the relationship between institutional memory and multiculturalism in schools. Since 2016, several reports from the Federal Council for Cultural Integration have emphasized the need to adapt Holocaust materials to educational contexts, where more than 50% of students do not have family roots in Europe. This does not imply relativizing the facts or modifying the content, but rather contextualizing the historical narrative as a universal foundation of human rights and state responsibility. In response, multilingual materials have been developed, along with curricular comparisons with other historical processes of exclusion and visual materials that situate the Nazi experience within an international framework for the prevention of state crimes. This strategy has been applied in schools in Berlin, Bremen, Hamburg, and Cologne with predominantly migrant student populations. In terms of infrastructure, the federal government has begun assessing the condition and geographic distribution of memorials used for school visits. In 2023, a €22 million funding package was approved to modernize educational memorial centers in regions with less coverage in order to guarantee equitable access for all students across the country. This investment not only improves the visiting experience, but also helps maintain educational standards in rural or less connected areas. Finally, a technical debate has begun on generational change in the teaching staff, as a significant portion of the professors who led the Holocaust teaching model since the 1980s will retire in the next decade. To ensure continuity of the approach, the Ministry of Education has funded specific university training courses in historical memory teaching, integrated into teacher training programs. From 2022, all teaching programs at German public universities must include at least one compulsory module on the teaching of contemporary German history. The current challenge is not for new generations to reject the past, but rather for the education system to continually update its mechanisms to ensure that this past continues to be understood, taught, and connected to the present. In this new era, memory is no longer sustained by biographical proximity, but by institutional structure, state control, and regulatory commitment. As a complement to audits and indicators, pilot programs measuring students' emotional perceptions of the Holocaust have been developed since 2020. These studies not only ask what students remember, but also how they process it. One of the most notable projects, carried out in Bavaria, compared learning outcomes with self-reported emotional reactions, allowing for the detection of areas of saturation and adjustment of content. This data helps balance the intensity of the material without diluting its educational value. The training of new teachers has also changed to meet current challenges. German public universities have incorporated specific modules on digital historical memory into their teaching programs. They teach students how to integrate tools such as Stolperwege or Limo platforms, combining technology with historical rigor. Part of the training includes how to moderate debates on hate speech, social media denial, and antisemitism in digital environments. Unlike previous decades, the emphasis is not only on transmitting knowledge, but also on preparing teachers capable of sustaining memory in diverse and connected classrooms where ties to the past are more fragile. Future teachers must demonstrate that they know how to translate history into meaningful experiences without trivializing or imposing it. The goal is to train mediators capable of keeping historical learning alive, even when personal biography no longer motivates it. Germany facing the judgment of the world, memory or exception. At the center of the continent, Germany has adopted a unique position, that of a nation that has turned its criminal past into a pedagogical, normative, and civic foundation. Unlike other countries that participated directly or indirectly in the crimes of Nazism, Germany has not attempted to dilute its responsibility, but rather to institutionalize it. This decision was neither immediate nor uniform, but once taken, it defined an educational trajectory that visibly contrasts with that of its neighbors. Is Germany a model to follow, or an exception caused by its own history? The most immediate comparison is Austria. Although it shared the language, culture, and part of the administrative apparatus of the Third Reich, including its head of state, after 1945, Austria developed a national narrative centered on victimhood. The dominant narrative for decades was that the country had been annexed and forced into the Nazi regime. This discourse avoided self-criticism and delayed any serious institutional effort to confront the past. It wasn't until 1991, under Chancellor Franz Vranitzky, that Austrian co-responsibility for the crimes of the Holocaust was officially recognized. In terms of education, Austria maintained a disparate approach. The Ministry of Education issued general recommendations on the Holocaust, but did not impose a mandatory, standardized curriculum nationwide. Each region managed its content independently. Until the 2000s, school textbooks barely included any testimonies or analyses of local collaboration. Hitler was portrayed as a radicalized Austrian politician, but the massive participation of Austrians in the SS, camp administration, or deportations was not explored in depth. In France, the treatment of the past was equally ambiguous. For decades, the national narrative focused on the heroic resistance against the Nazi occupation, obscuring the role of the Vichy regime and its collaboration in the persecution of Jews. Although figures such as Charles de Gaulle and the French state itself promoted Republican reconstruction, state responsibility for the deportations was not officially acknowledged until 1995, when President Jacques Chirac broke the institutional silence. The French education system gradually incorporated the Holocaust. The Ferry Law of 2002 made it compulsory teaching, but left teachers broad freedom to decide how to address it. The hours devoted to the study of antisemitism or the administrative machinery of the Vichy regime are unregulated. In practice, many schools limit themselves to brief mentions within the general history of the Second World War. Recent surveys reveal that less than 3% of French youth correctly identify camps such as Drancy or Pithiviers. Italy, the birthplace of European fascism, was even slower to incorporate critical analysis of its past. After the war, the official narrative was built on two pillars: the fall of Mussolini in 1943 and the partisan resistance in the north. These references made it possible to exclude from the collective memory the period 1922 to 1943, during which racial laws were enacted, opponents were persecuted, and open collaboration with the Third Reich took place. For years, Italian education included the study of Nazism without delving into the Italian state's role in the persecution of Jews and minorities. It wasn't until Law 211 of 2000 that the Day of Remembrance was instituted every January 27th. Since then, some regions have incorporated school visits to deportation sites like Fossoli or the synagogue in Rome, but there is no mandatory national plan to ensure systematic teaching about the Holocaust. In Spain, the Holocaust was a marginal topic for decades. Under the Franco dictatorship, the regime aligned itself ideologically with the Axis, sent the Blue Division to the Eastern Front, and provided refuge to Nazi collaborators. The democratic transition did not incorporate an analysis of local fascism or Spanish participation in the European context of persecution. It was not until 2006 that the Holocaust was included in official textbooks, and even today its treatment remains superficial. There is no legislation mandating its teaching, nor have educational platforms equivalent to those in Germany been developed. The lack of direct links to Nazism has been used as an argument for not establishing a more robust memory policy, ignoring the ideological, diplomatic, and administrative connections that did exist. In Eastern Europe, the picture is more complex. Poland, the territory where much of the Nazi extermination took place, has oscillated between recognizing the Jewish genocide and reaffirming its national identity as a victim. In 2018, the Polish government passed a law criminalizing claims of Polish involvement in Holocaust crimes, sparking international controversy. Although the Holocaust is taught in schools, the focus is on the suffering of Poles, leaving episodes of local collaboration or antisemitism in the background. Russia, for its part, has constructed a national narrative centered on the Great Patriotic War. The image of the Red Army as liberator overshadows any critical analysis of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the crimes of the NKVD, or internal repression. History education is tightly controlled by the state, and since 2020, formally equating Soviet communism with Nazism has been prohibited. The Holocaust is mentioned as part of Nazi crimes, but it is not a structural focus of the curriculum. Other European countries display fragmented approaches. In the United Kingdom, Holocaust education has been compulsory in secondary schools since 1991, but there is no national law mandating how it should be taught or how in-depth it should be. Many schools approach the subject through the study of the Anne Frank case without connecting the content to the administrative mechanisms of genocide. There is also no centralized assessment system or national impact indicators. Within this European landscape, another significant case is Hungary. Despite being a signatory to international treaties on historical memory, the Hungarian government has promoted educational reforms that minimize local involvement in the Holocaust and emphasize a nationalist view of the past. In 2021, academic organizations reported that new textbooks eliminated key references to the deportation of Hungarian Jews. This regression has been highlighted by European organizations as a worrying example of curriculum manipulation for ideological purposes. The Netherlands and Belgium present a more open model, with content integrated into the official curriculum. However, actual implementation varies by region. In Belgium, the division between the Flemish and French-speaking communities has generated significant pedagogical differences. In the Netherlands, although school visits to Westerbork and the Anne Frank House are organized, there is no national educational resource platform comparable to the German one. One of the clearest differences between Germany and the rest of Europe lies in criminal legislation. While in Germany, denying the Holocaust or publicly downplaying its crimes is a crime, in many European countries, such expressions are only punishable if they directly incite hatred. France, Austria, and Belgium have laws against denial, but their enforcement is more limited. In the United Kingdom, Sweden, and the Netherlands, denial is not criminalized, although it can be prosecuted as hate speech. Another key indicator is the public budget allocated to memory. Germany invests more than 120 million euros annually in educational programs, memorials, teacher training, and the production of materials. In France, the figure is around 25 million euros. In Spain, Poland, and Hungary, investments do not exceed 5 million euros and are subject to cuts or political conditions. At the international level, Germany has taken on the role of a policy advocate. It not only actively participates in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, (CHR), but has also led multilateral projects for the development of educational guidelines, comparative methodologies, and quality standards. It has exported its model through foundations, bilateral agreements, and technical cooperation, establishing itself as an institutional benchmark. This doesn't mean that the German model can be replicated in all countries. Its historical distinctiveness, federal structure, and legal framework make many of its tools difficult to transfer. But the underlying principle, building citizenship based on historical responsibility, can be adopted. The question is no longer whether everyone should copy the German model, but rather whether they are willing to critically examine their own past and turn it into a pedagogical tool. Germany's commitment to remembrance is also sustained through its cultural and media production. Since 2005, the Ministry of Culture has funded films, documentaries, and educational series focusing on the Holocaust, many of them distributed directly to schools or screened at international educational festivals. Works such as Das Radikal Böse and Shoah are used in the classroom as part of the curriculum. Furthermore, Germany promotes platforms such as the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, EHRE, which brings together archives, databases, and educational resources from across the continent. Remembrance is not treated as a niche or specialist topic, but as part of public culture. Children's books, social media campaigns, and documentary-based video games complement schoolwork, reinforcing Germany's role as a unique role model. Remembrance is not just taught. It is performed, discussed, and disseminated with sustained state support. Germany didn't choose its history, but it chose how to confront it, and in that choice it has become a conscious exception, not out of privilege, but out of responsibility.